Hey, while planning out videos for this winter, I kind of was stumped on December. I didn't know what I would do for a Christmas video. It doesn't seem like Christmas offers too much meaningful horror content that hasn't been done to death, things like The Nightmare Before Christmas or Black Christmas, which I recently just watched and it's actually a very good film. But, you know, I thought The Pale Blue Eye would be out by now, and it's not. It doesn't come out until January. So I'll do a video on that when it comes out, but for now I'm stuck. I had to come up with something. And I've always thought there's some sort of horror element to Christmas, like a slight eeriness, a slight creepiness about it that I could never put my finger on, because despite this feeling I always had, it's a very holy holiday, and I deservingly so. But I've always gotten this ghostly feeling about Christmas, and I feel like the stories like A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens are a better example of the vibes of Christmas than anything else. So imagine my joy and elation when I, desperately trying to find a video topic, Googled Christmas ghosts, and up came all of these results about the history of ghost stories and Christmas time. Now, this might sound odd to you. Ghost stories are most definitely a Halloween thing if you live in America, but if you were to live in Victorian England, ghost stories, well, that's a Christmas thing. You see, families would all gather around the hearth of the fireplace at the house, and they'd all tell their scariest ghost story before going to bed on Christmas. And this was the tradition for years. They would sit around and tell these stories, and I mean hundreds of years this was the tradition. But then came the invention of the printing press around Victorian England time, and to capitalize on this tradition of telling ghost stories around the fire, these publishing companies worked to crank out as many ghost stories as they could by this time, and A Christmas Carol is one of them. So if you've always found A Christmas Carol kind of odd, like why is there a book about ghosts that takes place at Christmas that's specifically very Christmassy? It's not just a story that takes place during Christmas by complete coincidence. It's a purely Christmas story, but it involves ghosts and spirits and some very scary, scary moments, particularly when he is visited by Marley. I think that is one of the creepiest things ever written down. It's from this tradition. That's where all that comes from. And if that for some reason doesn't make sense to you, let's really think about winter. Ghost stories to me make more sense in the winter time. It's white outside, it's cold, it's bleak, the skies are dark and gray, and there is no life anywhere. Trees are dead. There's a stillness and an eerie silentness to the woods. The snow itself, a pale white spirit. The fog of Halloween is traded for drifts of snow blowing across fields. What's not to be creepy about this? I can only really think of one good movie that really captures this thing that I'm talking about with the spirits and the ghostliness of winter. You see, there's different kinds of horror movies, and obviously The Thing probably pops in your mind when you think of winter horror movies, but that's a supernatural, sci-fi, existential kind of horror movie. What I'm talking about is straight up gothic, ghostly literature, storytelling. And I think the movie that does this the absolute best, and the only one I've really seen, if there are more, please leave me suggestions, because this is my favorite kind of horror, but that would be Crimson Peak. Now, I'm not going to talk about Crimson Peak in any kind of detail, but just the atmosphere of this movie gets that ghostly vibe of winter and Christmas, even though it doesn't really take place at Christmas, I don't believe, but it's wintry. It gets that ghostliness, that eeriness of winter completely right. And movies are how we tell stories in the modern day. It used to be telling them orally to your children, to your grandchildren, to people who would listen. It then became books, and now it has moved into movies, and even past that into certain kinds of social media platforms. All of the former still exists. People still tell stories, people still read books and write books, but visual media has taken over, and I think the best ghost story of the last 20 years comes from the movie Crimson Peak. I cannot come up with a good way to transition to this next part of the video. If that was interesting to you, thank you so much for watching. This next part of the video, I will be telling you a ghost story, so please enjoy. Please forgive what is most definitely overly dramatic lighting. But I thought, what better way to end this video than with some ghost stories by the fireplace. And hang on, something doesn't feel quite Christmassy enough. No, that's better. In the 1700s in America, there was a pirate who built a castle. This is in what became North Carolina. Now, he built this castle near a river, and he built it with many different trapdoors and entrances and hidden passages and things like that in order for him to better sneak around his treasure and avoid being caught by authorities. But as I imagine would be often the case with pirates, punishment did not elude this pirate. One of the men he consigned to work with him had a grandmother who was a witch, and she was not a fan of this pirate and what he had brought upon her family, so she placed a curse on him, and that his bloodline would die out before he could ever even have a grandson. He would never know what it would be like to have a grandson. This is the curse that is put on the pirate. Now, years went by, and it came so that this pirate's daughter was to be married. He was long dead, not in battle or shot down or executed or anything, but he died of disease. However, his daughter was set to marry, and they were going to be married in the castle. The day of the wedding came, and everyone was primed and ready, and the bride was ready, and the groom was ready, and then the ceremony began, and the groom stood up there with the bishop and all of the groomsmen and all of the people in the chapel that was in this castle, awaited the bride to come, and they began to play the music, and everyone stood up and turned around and waited for the bride to enter the room, and she didn't, and there was a bit of an awkward moment there, and so they played the music again, and again everyone turned around and looked, waited for the bride to come in, and she didn't. Now, overlooking this chapel was a big upper platform, sort of attic room, and suddenly, in this awkwardness, and the groom began to get a little nervous, he looked up and saw his bride standing up in this little attic, staring down at him, beckoning him towards her, and said, "You can marry me if you can catch me." She's teasing him to come catch her. And then she takes off running, and from where the way the room was set up, he could see that she ran off into one of the corridors and one of the passages that led up to that balcony. And so the groom runs out of the chapel and runs up to find her, and he sees her running down the hallway in her flowing white gown, and he's laughing and kind of nervous and doesn't understand what this game is and is kind of put off by it, and it's kind of like, okay, stop, this isn't funny. And she laughs and is moving about the corridors of the castle. At one point, he's right behind her, and she turns the corner, and as soon as he turns that corner, no bride is to be found. She was nowhere within the corridor. In front of him, there was no rooms for her to have jumped into. She wasn't there. The groom began to get nervous. He couldn't find her anymore. He could no longer hear her. And eventually the entire wedding party joined in the search. And they searched the whole castle to try to find the bride. But she was nowhere to be found. In fact, she was never found. She wasn't found that day. She wasn't found the next 2 days. She wasn't found the next 3 weeks of searching. She was never found again. And many, many years had passed. And some kids out one night, roaming the streets, looked up towards the castle and saw what they described to be a fountain of snow that had the figure of a young woman, and her hands were outstretched, and she was beckoning the boys towards the castle. So the story of the beckoning bride became sort of a local legend, and paranormal investigators began to show up. This is hundreds of years even after
the original account had taken place. The legend sort of grew, and the bride could only be seen on a clear New Year's night. Some of these paranormal investigators would show up on these New Year's evenings, and when they would see the bride, they would follow her into the castle. Once they got to the castle, she was no longer visible to them, but they entered the castle anyway. And as the castle grew older and into disrepair, many of the rooms and hidden passageways that the pirate had laid hundreds of years before had began to reveal themselves. And behind a crumbling wall near the bride's room, they found a secret panel which led to a hidden passageway. And in this hidden passageway, they found the skeleton of a young woman still in her bridal clothes. Many say that after they found her body, the bride quit beckoning people into the castle. But still some say on a clear New Year's night, you can look out towards this old castle in North Carolina and see the bride beckoning you to come find her. Another story from when the land was first being settled here in America. A man by the name of Lakey found a spot of land by a creek that he found suitable to build a cabin near. He then made it his mission to build this cabin, and he got right to work. With an axe, he chopped trees down and began to build quite a significant frame for a cabin for himself, and though simple, it was rustic and pretty and beautiful. And one night, after he had just fallen a big oak tree, which he planned to use for clapboards to make the roof of his cabin, some travelers happened across the creek where he had been working and found him laying on the ground, and when they went to investigate further, they had found that his head had been separated from his body, and the bloody axe that lay near him indicated to the men what had done the separating of the head from the body. This was troublesome to the people of the town in that area, and troublesome to, obviously, to the people who found him because of how gruesome the sight was, and also because this man had no enemies. No one disliked this man. He was actually very, very well liked. About a few weeks later, possibly 2 or 3 weeks later, some men were traveling back through this area from a trip they had taken to the Wabash River. And they were traveling back through this area, and it's just a small creek that runs through a little town. And they passed the, unfinished ruins of the cabin that poor Lakey had tried to build, and they passed the spot where he had been killed. And suddenly they noticed, it was late at night, and suddenly they noticed another rider had come up alongside them. And he walked with them and kept pace for a little while, and the men were silent, and so was the rider. And when they had come up over a little hill, the rider that had followed them was silhouetted against the dark sky. Even though it was dark, it was slightly more light than it had been down in the valley where they were walking, where the creek was. And anyway, he was silhouetted against the moonlight, and they could see that this rider had no head. Rather put off by this as one might be, the two men frantically crossed the creek, and as the rider crossed with them, he simply turned his horse and walked into the creek and dissipated into the water. The men were hesitant to tell this story, but when they finally did, they were relieved when others came forward with the same experience. This rider that would ride alongside them and then turn and mist back into the creek. Everyone described the rider as being a sort of a mist, like not a fully solid form, and when he would walk back into the creek, he would simply merge back into the water as if it had always been a part of it. And the spirit wasn't hostile. The spirit simply guided those along the creek and possibly tried to seek answers and find the man that had taken his head. And perhaps then, if he had found that man, the writer might have subsided with his docileness and taken the man who had taken his head into the waters with him. This is undoubtedly a holy time of year, but it's also a spooky time of year. And that's what I've hoped to do with this video, is just bring out the idea that ghost stories hit differently at Christmas time. So, whether you're watching this after Christmas, or simply just trying to get away from your family, I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.